Hello everybody and welcome. I'm John Burdock of Epic J Creations, and in this video we're going to learn how to take a character that was originally made and textured for a different render engine, and we're going to go ahead and reset up and convert that character to work and run perfectly with Octane render inside Cinema 4D. For example, we're going to take this character here that was originally made to work with the physical render engine inside Cinema 4D, and we're going to go ahead and convert all these materials over so it works and renders perfectly with Octane render. Now, another interesting thing is that this video is also going to span across two different courses. So it's going to be available both in the Octane Master course and the Mesh Evo course. The Octane Master course, in case you don't know, is the world's most advanced Octane training for Cinema 4D and Octane render, where you could learn anything about Octane render in Cinema 4D that you ever would want to know, such as material creation, render settings, multi-pass systems, project-based videos, and so much more, including every single node that is available in Octane render. There's a distinct video for every single node, so you can learn all about them. Now, for Mesh Evo, in case you don't know what that is, Mesh Evo is the most advanced character creation training for Cinema 4D that you can buy right now. This course, Mesh Evo, teaches you everything you could ever want to know about character creation inside Cinema 4D. This includes modeling your character from scratch, every single element from basically the very beginning. You start with nothing and then you create and make a fully featured character, which is what we see right here. This includes everything from modeling your character, texturing your character, weighting your character, and rigging your character. If we go ahead and pan around here, we can see that we have rigs. Example, some of these awesome rigs is this these eye rigs here, which is really nice. You can pull this around, the eyes will look at it. There's different head rigs where we can rotate. I'll do a quick little example here. We could rotate the head here, left and right. We even have little eyebrow rigs, which are really cool here, so we can like up and down and do different morphs and stuff for the eyes, to do different poses, many different things. All this is taught and so much more in the Mesh Evo course. Like the training available in that is incredible. And because both of these courses both teach inside Cinema 4D to an extent, and both of them are one of the biggest courses on their distinct topics, I thought it'd be a really good idea to have a hybrid video that would mesh across both of them. So both Octane Master Course students will be able to watch this video as well as Mesh Evo students. Now that we have out of that way, I do want to go ahead and talk about and mention the differences between both courses in what they're going to have access to as far as asset files. For the Mesh Evo students, you'll go ahead and have access to this entire model. You're going to have everything already rigged because I'm assuming you have already built and made this. You've already followed the course along and you already have access to this. Now, for Octane Master Course students, you are going to have access to the mesh of this character. You're going to have basically this character here, but you are not going to have any of the rigging tools. Those are exclusive to Mesh Evo students, but that said, you're still going to be able to follow along, no problem, because this video is just going to be talking about the texture setup. If you would like to have a fully rigged character like this or learn how to create one, you are going to have to actually purchase the Mesh Evo course. Now that we have that out of the way, I want to go ahead and mention that in the description of this video, you are going to have access to both a link to the Octane Master course as well as the Mesh Evo course page. So go ahead and check that out if you're interested in either one of those. But with all of this out of the way, let's go ahead and dive in and get started. To begin, we have our character here, and it is already set up and ready to render with the physical render. If I go to my render settings up here and set my physical render settings to progressive, so it renders a little bit quicker, and we go ahead and hit render, you can see that this character, again, is already set up to go. For Mesh Evo students, this will not be a surprise to you because you will have watched the videos and learned how to set up this character like this for the physical render. Now, for Octane Master Course students, if you would like to learn how to texture a character to look like this for the physical render engine, again, you're going to have to check out the Mesh Evo course because that is where they teach that. Now that we understand that though, again, let's go ahead and move forward. The first thing we need to do now is take this character that has been textured for the physical renderer, which we can see here is all the materials here. We need to convert these materials over to a Octane material. Now we could delete them and by hand recreate each individual material, and we could go ahead and take all these image textures that are part of creating this character, the one that you learn in the Mesh Evo course, how to paint with body paint and export out of Cinema 4D through its bakers. Now if you'd like to make these image textures yourself and learn how to do that, again, check out the Mesh Evo course where they go through all the process of making these from scratch. But if you would like to just have access to them for this video, there is going to be a pop-up on the left side on where you can download them for the Octane Master Course students, where they are located to download and get them. And for the Mesh Evo students, that directory is popping up on the right side over here. Now, these image textures are what make up this fully textured character. We need those to actually texture this character. And again, we could dump all these materials and then just by hand replug all these back in and reconnect all those materials to the different parts of our character, but that would just be a ton of work. Luckily, Octane has a much faster and quicker method of going through and converting those and attaching and hooking them up. The way we do this is we simply select all the materials that we have here in our material viewer here, and then what we want to do is go up to materials and then select and click on convert materials. Once we've done that, they will start going through and converting the materials, and they'll start slowly but surely going through, and what it's going to do actually is take all those materials, remove the original C4D material, and then create a duplicate of them as an Octane material, convert everything over, and reattach the Octane variant of those materials to our character rig and different meshes. Once this is done, you might be tempted, okay, I'll just manually dump these old ones because we don't need them anymore. Well, that can be a little dangerous. You might accidentally delete one of the Octane ones. So instead, just go ahead and deselect everything, go up to materials up here, and then do remove unused materials. Remember, these Octane materials have been connected now in place of these old C4D ones. So those old Cinema 4D ones are no longer attached, which means when we click remove unused materials, it simply erases them. And now we have a perfectly clean and set up scene where each material has been created for every aspect of our character that was originally there, and it has been properly converted over. Now, the Octane conversion method works pretty good, but there can be some problems. And if we go ahead in Octane Render and go ahead and hit render right now, we're going to notice a few issues with our character. And you can see that, yes, we are getting some problems. Now, there's a lot of things going on here, including with the fact that we're actually having lights being lit in our scene using the actual scene lights. Now, you may not have access to these. It depends what the scene files end up turning out to be. But for me, I do have all these lights, and we don't actually want these lights in our scene. We're just going to take the whole scene thing for me, and I'm just going to delete it because I want to use actual Cinema 4D lights. And for us, we're just going to go ahead and light everything with an Octane Daylight object. So we'll go ahead and grab that. You could also create that by going to Objects, Lights, Octane Daylight. And then for that, simply what I like to just do is I will just go ahead, press R, rotate, grab the red rotation line, drag it down to -40 degrees, maybe create an infinite floor as well. Go into our Octane Daylight settings, set our sky torpidity to 3 and our sun size to 30. And there we go, that's a little better. Now let's go ahead. Before we talk about the elephant in the room, which is the displacement, which I know is very apparent, that's a huge issue, let's go ahead and set our kernel to path tracing so things look a little nicer. And then for our render settings, we're going to do a quick little setup. We're going to use the preset default that we learned how to make in the Octane Master Course beginning. Now, if you haven't followed along in the Octane Master Course or don't have access to it, and you might be an Mesh Evo user, don't worry, all my preset settings are simply max samples of 1600, adaptive noise threshold set to on and set to a value of 0.02. Then I go to my settings, go to environment, and change my default environment color to black so it no longer is showing up through there, so we don't have like an ambient, a light emission going throughout our whole scene. And finally, on our camera imager, I like to set my response to linear, my gamma to 2.2, and my natural response checked on. After that, we are good to go. Nothing else needs changed. Now that we've done this, let's go ahead and talk about the first and biggest and most important issue, and that is this displacement problem we're having here. The reason that our displacement looks so weird is if we go ahead and open up the material that is for our character's mesh, the one causing the problem, and it can be a little tricky to kind of scroll through here and figure out which one it is. The easiest way to find it is simply use your material picker here, turn that on by clicking on it, and then wherever we click in our Octane Live viewer, it'll automatically select the material down here for us. Now I'm using the default node editor layout for Octane, so I just have my node editor docked over here. If you would like though, you can, if you don't have this layout already, you can go ahead and just double click the material and then select Node Editor. That is another way of getting access to the Node Editor. But I'm just going to go over here where I have it docked. I have this set up just because it's easier to record videos with, so you can see it all in one screen. And you'll notice in this material we have displacement. And if we go ahead and unplug displacement, we can see that that has been fixed. Now, for Octane Master Course users, you might be a little bit confused why there is actually displacement on our character. Now, this was something that I didn't realize until recently, and this is that in very distinct and high-end workflows where character creation is involved, they will almost always, in very high-end characters, especially for film, not necessarily for video games, but mostly for film, they will actually have two versions of the character. They'll have the low poly original, that's what we have here, and then they'll have a high poly version that has a ton of polygons and has been going through a lot of sculpting. They'll sculpt in all kinds of details, such as more detail on the nose, the mouth, and maybe some scars or something on the face. What they will then do is bake out a displacement map of that high poly character so they can apply displacement to our low poly mesh so that the detail then at render time can come through. The reason that they do this is because a low poly character, like we have now, is much lighter and easier to animate and rig and move around, but later on, after our character has been animated through our kind of preview we have here, like say we want to select maybe the head here, we could select the head and then rotate it. This goes much quicker and faster since we are doing it with a low poly character than, say, for example, a high poly character. And it's a little slow and laggy because I'm trying to do Octane at the same time. But this would be much worse if we had a high poly character, right? That would be a big problem if we had a bunch of polygons, like a million of them. That's why it's very important that we have a low poly mesh. That said, our character doesn't look as realistic when it is this kind of low poly and blocky, like for example here on the nose. And another perfect example is kind of like on the nostrils here. This is just extremely low poly. This said, if we subdivide and then displace this character, all that detail from a high poly mesh that we sculpted and baked down onto this can come through and it'll look much better. This entire process is explained in very amazing detail, and all Mesh Evo students already, I'm sure, have a very good handle and understanding of this. I'm just mentioning this so that the Octane Master Course students can get an idea of why there is actually a displacement map. Now that we understand that, moving on, we're going to go back to our node editor, and again, we need to get this displacement to work like it originally did inside Cinema 4D, because of course what we have here does not look correct. Now there's a very distinct reason for this. The first thing first is that if we go over to our asset files, we can see over here that we have something here called Romy Displacement Tangent. Now, Romy is the name of our character, and the displacement is the map, and the tangent is the type of displacement map. Now, there is actually two different distinct types of displacement maps. There is a vertex displacement map, and there is a black and white height displacement map. Height displacement maps are simple because all they are is black and white, but the problem is with them, they only displace up and down. A black and white displacement map can look actually very similar to a bump map or a reflection map. It's still just simply black and white. White will push up and black will push down. Now the problem with this is it is extremely simple, and in most cases for a character, especially when you're trying to create a lot of advanced details, we'll remove the displacement for now, it will not work and look very good at all. For example, what if we wanted to sculpt in a detail like a scar that would kind of go in and then over to the right? That simply cannot happen. You cannot have very complex sculpted details on your character, and that's not, quite honestly, good enough. We need to be able to have high-end characters with very advanced amounts of deformation and displacement on their face, just so it is if we were modeling the character with those high poly polygons. Luckily, there is a workaround and another type of displacement map that we can use, and that is this one. You'll notice this displacement map is not black and white. In fact, it looks very similar to a normal map, as it's almost rainbow looking with many different colors. This is called a vertex displacement map. Now, a vertex displacement map is much more advanced. This can displace in all three axes at once. This means we could displace a scar that would go in and then over to the side, or maybe over to the left, and we can create very complex detail. And any type of displacement or high poly mesh that you would start with and sculpt, you can sculpt almost any type of detail you want on that high poly mesh and then bake that down as a displacement map for your low poly object, which is our character here. Again, this is all going over in great detail in the Mesh Evo course, so definitely check that out if you're interested, if you're an Octane Master Course student. But what we're going to go ahead and do now is we want to take this vertex displacement map. We want to actually get Octane to read this correctly. Now to do this, we need to select our displacement map, and of course we're going to plug it back in, and we're going to tell Octane to read this instead of a height displacement map, but as a vertex displacement map. Now Octane refers to a height displacement map as just simply texture displacement. Here's our type slider, our value up here. We want to change this to vertex displacement. Now I really want to point this out right now. Octane Master Course users, if you have Octane, or even Mesh Evo users, if you have Octane Render 4.0, you will not have access to vertex displacement maps, I'm afraid. This is only for the latest Octane 2019 users. This is a new feature that came to Octane Render, and I'm afraid it's only available to Octane 2019 users, not Octane version 4 users. This said, don't worry. After I show how to do this method, I'm going to show you a workaround where any Octane user, it doesn't even matter if you have even Octane 2 or Octane 2.0 or Octane 3, you'll still be able to follow along. So just because you can't follow along now, in case you have Octane 4.0, don't worry, I will show you a workaround. But for everybody else, let's go ahead and move forward. And what we do is we take our type from take our type from texture displacement to vertex displacement. The next thing we need to do is we need to set our vector space from object to tangent. Now, there's actually a very distinct reason for this. You might be kind of wondering, why do we have two different types of displacement types? And yes, our character looks a little bit funny right now, but we will get this fixed up really soon. The reason that there is two different types, we have vector displacement, we have object and tangent. In our vector displacement, we have two types. The reason that we have that is there actually is two different types of vector displacement. There is object and there is tangent. Now this is a very big topic, the differences between them, but basically to sum it up, object type of displacement maps work great on a static character that isn't going to be moving, but if he's going to turn the character's going to turn her head or move her hands or something, then like our character here, it will not work good because object displacement only works for static objects that do not move. Now if you have an object that does move, such as bending fingers or moving hands or tilting heads or an opening mouth or eyes or anything moving like that, then you'll want to use tangent displacement. And that is the exact type of map that we actually baked out where the students of the Mesh Evo course learned to bake out. And that is the the map that we do have here. So we do want to make sure that underneath our displacement, we do set this to be tangent. Now, even though we have that set up, you'll see that still doesn't look quite right. And that's because by default, the Octane material, you can see, has defaulted converting the C4D height over to 2 centimeters. That is what Cinema 4D defaulted to actually setting the displacement height to. That's what this mesh displacement map was meant for, to be a height of around 2 centimeters. That's what it looked good with in Cinema 4D. Now, Octane reads things differently. So this height data will not work. It's actually far too strong. What we need to do is drop our height down to 0.2. We'll go ahead and press enter. Instantly, it starts to work. What we have to do literally is you just pull the digit back one level. So if you have a displacement height of 2, you need to make it work with Octane. You just simply move the digit back, so you just make it 0.2. So you just pull a digit in front of it. Example, if you have a value of 10, that should be dropped to, if we pull the value over, it should be 1. I believe it would drop down to 1 if you normally had a value of 10. I think that math is right. But basically, if you have a 2, you want to go to 0.2. If you have a 5, you want to go to 0.5, etc. Now that we have this set up, you'll notice, okay, I guess we have some displacement going on, but our character is still low poly. What is the point of this? The beauty of having vertex displacement is that you can actually subdivide your mesh to match what it was originally with the high poly one. Because this map was originally meant to have a subdivision, when this mesh was created, it started out with this low poly character. In the Mesh Evo course, this is what they did. They started with this low poly character then, once they made it. Then they subdivided it 3 levels and sculpted the detail onto it. That means for this map, when we bake it out, we need to actually subdivide this mesh 3 levels for it to look correct. Select our displacement, go to subdivision level, and set a value of 3. Once this happens, it'll start adding that detail to our character, and you can see that now that we zoomed in, we can see that the nostrils here, for example, are much, much smoother. We no longer have, if we go ahead and take our subdivision level back down to 0, this low poly kind of rough mesh. Now if I go back to our view over here, you can see here is the low poly one that's going in. We have to make sure we're in the view mode for that to actually update. And you can see very, very low poly. I'm going to go ahead and take our subdivision level and point it back up to 3, and you can see instantly this is looking a lot better. Now the problem is a lot of our details are simply not coming through, and I kind of lost my camera position here. I'll do Control-Shift-Z, there we go. Now the reason that this is not coming through too well and that a lot of our displaced details aren't showing up, it is a little bit, but it's mostly just rounding everything off, and it's not looking quite too right. The reason for this is if we go back to our Octane node editor here, and we could increase the value here, maybe to punch this up a little stronger. The reason that these the strength values are not showing through so well, and it's just not bringing out the detail, is the displacement type that Octane uses here is one that doesn't distinctly work too well with our particular character and this type of displacement map. This was a type of displacement map that works best, that the one that C4D baked out of. Not saying that Vertex maps in general don't work with the Octane. They can. They work really well in most cases. But the particular type of Vertex Displacement Map that is baked out of Cinema 4D can have some issues with this displacement node that we have inside Octane. One of the issues you'll notice up here is how it handles the UV seams. We actually have some UV seams on our character right here where the UVs split for the original cut so they can map around the character's head. If we go ahead and open up our color map on our character, you can see here's where the UV split happens and it rotates over. This causes issues in the displacement in how the displacement map actually handles edges of seams on a UV map. Now, this issue is not caused because the C4D displacement map is broken or that the Octane displacement node is broken. It's just simply two different types of formats and processes that don't necessarily correspond or work well together. This could be fixed, for example, if the displacement node had some different options in how it interprets the seams that are connected here for the displacement. But this said, for now, there is really no way of getting this Octane displacement to work. I do really want to point that out. At this current time, we cannot get this particular displacement map from Cinema 4D to render and look correct using the Octane displacement node, even though it is a very nice vertex displacement method that does work really well with other maps, even other maps from Cinema 4D, but it does struggle with areas that have distinct seams like this where they're trying to connect through and then displace. Luckily, there is some workarounds we can use. Now, the workaround is we can actually use Cinema 4D's displacement methods where we actually have the option to change how it actually interprets these seams and it will clean it up. This is something that I figured out a little bit ago and it's a pretty cool little workaround. And what's beautiful about this workaround I'm about to show you is that it works with any single render engine. That would be Redshift, that would be Arnold, that would be Octane. It doesn't matter what version of Octane you have because we're going to do all this displacement inside of Cinema 4D and then have Octane render it after that is completed, so we can actually make that work. To do this, we're just going to take this entire displacement setup and we're going to delete it. We don't want it anymore because we are not displacing in Octane. We're going to do the displacement in Cinema 4D. You might be wondering, well, how are we going to do that? Let's go ahead and find out. What we're going to do is we're going to go over here to our character. We're going to find our mesh. We're going to go over here and grab our mesh right here. And then what we're going to do is we're actually going to go right up here to our deformers tab, and we're going to go ahead and grab the displacement deformer. I think you're probably catching on what we're about to do right now. We're going to go ahead and grab our displacement deformer and pull it in right next to our mesh. We're not going to put our mesh under the displacement deformer because remember, we also need to subdivide this mesh. We can't just displace the low poly because we also have to have more polygons for that detail to show through. What we're going to do is we're going to select our mesh, hold down left shift, also grab our displacer, do the shortcut Alt plus G to put both of them into a null. You could also do this by simply just going up to your tab up here and creating a null. But we're just going to do the shortcut Alt plus G to save some time. And then we're going to create a subdivision surface object by selecting right up here. Take this subdivision surface object and put it in the null with both of them. Now, let's go ahead and take our mesh and put it underneath the subdivision surface so it starts to get subdivided. Now notice, we're just going to go ahead and organize everything. We have our displacer in the null with our subdivision surface object that has our mesh as a child underneath the subdivision surface object. This means that we can have our subdivided mesh and then displace that subdivided mesh with our displacer because the displacer, as any deformer, will work with any fellow children that are also a child of the same null. So because both our displacer and our subdivision surface are both under the same null, they will both work together and function. This is really cool because right now we are subdividing our character, and if we go ahead and select our displacer, go to shading, and then again, we have to go ahead and find that image texture. Here it is, here again, link popping up over on the left side for Octane Master Course students. We can get these asset files, and for Mesh Evo students on the bottom right. We're going to go ahead and drag and drop our roaming displacement tangent, our vertex displacement map. That's a tangent displacement map. Drag and drop this into the shader slot right here. And instantly, we are going to be fraught with problems. As you can see, it does not look too good. In fact, it looks even worse than Octane. Don't worry, though. This is simply just because we need to change a few settings. First thing we need to do, go to Object Mode. Change our type from Intensity Centered to our Tangent. Remember, this is a Vertex Tangent map. So let's go ahead and set that there. That kind of fixed it, but made it pretty bad too. The second thing is we need to make sure our height value is correct. Remember, this should be a height of 2 centimeters. That's originally what looked good with the Cinema 4D material. And the only reason I know that is because I actually looked at the Cinema 4D material before I deleted it. And you guys could have seen that too if you would have opened it up before I told you to dump it too. That was my bad. We probably should have took a look at that, but it's a good thing I have this memorized. So we're going to go ahead, take our height value, and drop it. This one we don't have to do any conversion. We can actually just set it to the default 2 centimeters, just like with the Cinema 4D material. It works in a 1-to-1 ratio in Cinema 4D, which is pretty nice. You'll notice it looks a little better, but still looking pretty bad. This is one little final trick or gotcha that can kind of happen. If we go over to shading, we want to actually open up our shader here where our image texture is applied. And we need to make sure that its color profile is changed from embedded default to sRGB. This is very important, so it actually reads the map with the right color profile so the shape and everything looks correct. Once I set this, instantly everything is much, much better. Now, you will notice that we're still having the same issue like we did with the Octane displacement as we're getting this issue with the seam here. What is amazing, though, is if we select our subdivision surface, we can change and adjust how the displacement and the subdivision surface handles the edges of the seams on the UV map for our character here. Right here, we have Subdivide Uvs. How do we handle that? Because again, when we subdivide our mesh, it's also subdividing the UV map and how the texture is read. Right now, it's set to edge mode, and this is our problem causer. This is how C4D defaults to reading it for our subdivision surface, and this is also how the Octane displacement node also defaults to reading it too, and is actually the only way that it reads it at this time. Hopefully Octane will eventually update the node to give us options like our subdivision surface does here to change it. Such, for example, in here we can fix this problem by changing it from the default edge to standard. As soon as we do that, problem solved, the issue is fixed. And in fact, it fixes more issues that were caused by the edge displacement as well. If we go to our Subdivide UV, set it back to edge, you'll notice that our ears get like this kind of pinch here, right on the corner here and here. This is not correct and not how it's supposed to look. Set this again back to standard, and then we get the proper kind of roll off and edging on the ears without the kind of pinching issue there. This gives us a gorgeous, much better, high-quality subdivision for our character. And now, if we go ahead and look at the face of our character, and we turn our displacement on and off, this is off, and this is on, you can see that our character looks much better. And in fact, we're not even quite done yet. We need to take our subdivision surface and make sure that our subdivision for both the editor and the renderer are both set to a value of 3. Because remember, for Mesh Evo students, when the character was created, you used a level 3 subdivision for your top sculpt when you baked out that displacement map. So that means our mesh must be at least level 3 subdivision for it to properly work. Now this said, if we go above level 3 on our subdivision, the polygons won't match up properly with the displacement map, and it can cause some issues. Luckily with this displacement method, you can go above because we're just using a subdivision surface, but if you are actually using the Octane displacement node or even the Cinema 4D material displacement, you can get issues if you use a subdivision level that is higher than what the bake was originally intended for. Basically, you're creating polygons that the displacement map isn't accounting for. So you can get some issues. So your best rule of thumb is to always use the same subdivision level that you originally did for your high poly mesh that you exported the displacement map out for. Now that we have this done, though, you can see that we have this really cool character with proper displacement. We have our subdivision surface that we can enable and disable at will, and we can also turn on and off our displacement at will. And this is extremely powerful, massively useful. We can literally disable both of these, go ahead, animate our character, edit it, do whatever we want in the low poly mode, super light, much quicker, easy to work with, and then when we're ready to go, just go ahead and turn both our displacer and our subdivision surface back on, and boom, we're ready for the render queue. So we can go ahead and throw this in the render, start rendering it out, and it will look super good. We're going to go ahead and leave our displacement and subdivision surface on for now so our character can look the best while we're getting it retextured. But the first issue that I would like to go ahead and move on to as we start handling and managing our texturing in Octane is we want to go ahead and fix up the teeth here, because again, Octane does a decent job converting the Cinema 4D materials over, but it's not perfect. As you can see, it's actually interpreting the teeth as a light. So to go ahead and do this, we're going to zoom in on the teeth. We're going to use our material picker, and we're just going to go ahead and click in the live viewer. It'll automatically select the teeth down here for us because we have our material picker selected. We're going to go ahead and switch over to our node editor, and we're just going to go ahead and delete this texture emission node that was created because we don't want our teeth to be light bulbs. Now that we've gone ahead and removed that, we're going to select this node and go ahead and see what Octane has set this up for. It's set to diffuse material, which is not necessarily what we want. We're going to go ahead and switch this to a glossy material. Then we're going to go over to our index, and I'm going to use a value of 1.45. This is what I just feel that looks best for teeth. You can go ahead and change this to what you'd like it to be. For me, though, I feel like an index of 1.45 is good. Next, we're going to take our specular, make sure we have a full value of 1, so the teeth do have like a nice shine to them. Then we're also going to set our diffuse value to something in the range of like 90. Now that we've done that, let's go ahead and start finishing up and texture the other elements of the character. For this part, you can just kind of grab the material picker, and let's just go ahead and see which one next should be fixed. Right now, this eyeglass element needs kind of some work, so let's go ahead and grab that. We'll just material pick this. Instantly, it'll switch our material over to the eyeglass, update our node editor. If we scroll out a little bit, we should find it. Here it is, our eyeglass material. It's a specular material, and there's a few things I would like to change on it. The first one is if we go to transmission, we notice that it is not getting the proper blue color that the character should be getting through it. It has a little bit of blue set, but not quite enough. For me, I would like it to be a little bit more blue. Something about that, maybe 20% blue. It's already got the color palette about set up for us, which is quite nice. The next thing I want to do is I want to keep so much of this caustic from shining through. I don't really like how much of this caustic that's coming through. This is technically more realistic that it is doing that, but for me, I was hoping the lens could be something that wouldn't be as much like glass, that would have as much kind of caustic shining on the face. For me, it's more distracting than it is nice looking. So what I'm going to go ahead and do is go over to common and check on fake shadows. This just allows the light to shine through the object without being refracted and turning into caustic. So it just prevents caustics from shining through it. And what it does is it more just allows the light to be tinted a color. And this is more of the look that I would like to go after. So feel free to change this if you'd like, but for me, that is about what I'm after right there. Next up, we're going to go ahead and switch over to roughness, and we could play around with a little bit of that. I think a value of like 0.01, just a little bit, kind of is a little cool. I kind of like how it blurs it maybe a little bit. Again, though, this is subjective, up to you to decide on if you want that or not. That's about all I want to do with here. You could adjust the index value if the one, it's already brought over a value of 1.12. Which is doing pretty good. I mean, you could up this to a higher value if you would like, something like 1.56, which is the index of refraction for glass. Looks kind of cool, but for me, that feels a little too strong, to be quite honest, so 1.12 is going to be pretty good. I'm just going to go ahead and leave it at that right there. Now that we've done that, let's go ahead and move over, and now let's go ahead and fix this lighting issue we're getting on the side of the character's head. This is basically a light emissive texture here, and it is this little blue ring going around right here. And if we go ahead and middle click on that, or left mouse click with our material picker, I should say, we can now see that yes, it is a light, and here's the problem. It is just far too bright, and it also is casting shadows, and it's also showing up in reflections and a bunch of other things, just like a regular light would. For me personally, I don't actually want this light acting like a physical light. I would like it to look like a light in the fact that it's bright, but I don't want it to actually shine on anything, because that's just more calculations that need done. It'll just increase our render times, and it doesn't really seem necessary. Let's go ahead and select our texture emission node, take our visible and diffuse, uncheck visible and specular, and finally uncheck cast shadows. That has completely removed it from having an effect on our scene, so it's no longer casting shadows, no longer show up in diffuse or specular materials, and it's really cleaned that up quite nicely. On top of that, I'm also going to check on surface brightness because this is going to limit the brightness to the actual surface area of the object, and in this case, it's actually making it much less bright. This is just giving me a little bit more control about dialing it in, because if I had surface brightness unchecked, it's like no matter what level I put it at, it's still extremely bright, and I have to go really low to even get the thing to turn off. So basically, it's better off to have surface brightness on in this case because it actually lets me more manually control and have more fine-tuning abilities of this brightness level. And in fact, a value of 1 by default seemed to work pretty dang well. So we're just going to go ahead and leave that right there. Next up, we have our nice kind of white kind of metallic element here. What we're going to do is grab that right now, and let's go ahead and adjust a few parameters in here. Now for this, what I would like to change on it is I think it would look really cool with Octane because it does reflection so well, is if we went ahead and we first started by just selecting our material here, we can see that we have the image texture loaded in there, which is nice. That's run into the bump, and that's giving us some really good detail on here. What I would like to change is if we go ahead and select our main material, let's go over to Basic and change this from a diffuse material to something like a universal material. This will give us some nice, by default, metallic values on here. And if we go ahead and just take our roughness and crank that up maybe to something like, I don't know, maybe a value of like 0.2. 0.2 feels pretty good. Let's give ourselves a little bit more space here. 0.2, maybe 0.3. 0.3 is looking pretty good. Let's make sure our metallic value is at full 1. It is, and to be quite honest, that's really all there really is to do here. One thing I will change is if we go over to Basic, is I will change something called our BRDF model from Octane to GGX. This is just how Octane, you can see here, this is GGX, compare how it shows up in here. We have GGX, and we have Octane. This is our BRDF model, basically determines how roughness is calculated on reflections in Octane. And GGX is simply just a more realistic type of roughness calculator. GGX is more for organic materials, something like skin, hair, food, even grass and wood and stuff like that. And Beckman is something that's typically used for more industrial type metals or something like that. So anything like steel or anything like that. So actually, now that I think about it, this is actually probably something more like a metal, so we should set this to something like a Beckman. And the Beckman, you can see, looks really good on that. You can see the difference between Beckman, this is GGX, and this one's the Beckman. So you can see the Beckman really does add more of a metallic look to this. It really does look much more like metal. I'm going to go ahead and take our roughness, because under the Beckman BRDF model, it doesn't quite give it enough roughness as I would like. So I'm going to go ahead and up this to something like 0.5. And that is pretty nice. 0.5 is a little much. Maybe 0.4. There we go. That's looking pretty darn nice. Okay, now that we have this done, let's just go ahead and move on to the real meat and potatoes of this video, and that is going to be the actual texturing of the skin and the clothing of this character. This is probably 90% of the most important piece here. So let's go ahead and dive in and start working on that. We're just going to use our material picker, select our character, and it'll go ahead and again load this up. Now, we've already looked at this material a little bit when we were playing around with displacement until we set up our displace on our subdivision surface. Very nice setup we have here. But what we're going to do to start is I'm going to talk about how the Octane material converter, when we started out in this video, went to materials and we did convert materials. That does a really good job, and it's really nice, and it actually does a pretty good job of converting over and bringing most of the assets over from the original Cinema 4D materials. This said, it's not perfect, and it can have a few issues. In this example, for example, we're actually missing two image textures here. We're missing our roughness map and we're missing our specular map. Now that's okay. We can simply go over to our file explorer over here where we have these assets. And again, you can download these for the Octane Master Course users, location popping at the bottom left, and for Mesh Evo students, link popping up in the bottom right. What we're just going to simply do is just drag and drop the missing elements into the area. We have our reflection. This is what we need, so let's go ahead and drag and drop that in there. Next up, we also have our roughness. Let's select that and also drag that and drop that into there as well. Now that we have both of them ported in, let's just go ahead and organize things a little bit. And just a quick little shortcut, what we can actually do is hold down left control on our keyboard while our mouse is hovering over our node editor tab, and press tab on our keyboard. And this will actually full screen our node editor, so it's much easier to look at. This is pretty handy. And at any time, I can hold down left control and press tab to re-minimize the size of that window. So I can easily maximize and minimize windows at will. I can even use my materials here, minimize, maximize, our asset manager over here, minimize, maximize, etc. Plenty of cool options you can do with this. So go ahead, again, let's do that. Left control plus tab, maximize our node editor view. Let's go ahead and start working here. Let's first go ahead and start organizing things. We need our specular map, so that's our roughness, so we're going to put that one down here. This one here is our reflection, and reflection is going to be our specular maps. Let's go ahead and plug that in right here. Now for our specular maps, because these were originally meant to work for Cinema 4D, there is some optimization and changes we're going to have to do for this to make it work with Octane. Because again, these maps were originally baked out and meant to be used with Cinema 4D materials, not with Octane materials. So we are going to have to change a few things. For example, to get our specular map to actually render correctly and actually shine through, I found that you need to change the gamma from 2.2 to something like 1.25 or 0.25. In this particular case, I found a value of 0.25 to be very good. It's interesting to note that this actually same effect of having to adjust the gamma from a default 2.2 to something like a 1.25 or 0.25 actually counts and goes the same for Substance Painter materials. So if you export any maps out of Substance Painter, you typically need to adjust the gamma inside of Octane for there as well. Same thing also goes for our roughness maps. Go ahead and take that roughness map, plug that in, and we're also going to drop our gamma on here. I found that particularly in this case, lower values add more roughness, and higher values mean less roughness. So a value of 8 is going to give us very little roughness. I'm going to go ahead and do Control-Tab, minimize this window, and you can see here's our character rendering very little roughness. Let's go ahead and drop this back. Let's do something like 0.25, right? 1.25 gives us a little bit more roughness, but not quite enough. But we don't want to use a value of 0.25 because a value of 0.25 is just going to be way too rough. It's going to be far more roughness than we actually want. If we go ahead and zoom in on our character's face up here, turn to the side, you can see that our character is very, very rough. So we don't want that. I found a value in this particular case for our roughness to be pretty good at a value of 0.8, believe it or not. That actually looks pretty good. Speaking of roughness, remember how I was just talking about if we go to our material here and go to basic, we have BRDF models. These are how roughness is calculated on the reflection of our material. And again, the Octane one is not the most realistic one. The more realistic models are something like Beckman, GGX, or Ward. Remember how we were talking about how Beckman was used for more metallic elements and stuff, and GGX was for more organic things such as skin, hair, and types of food and stuff like that. Again, this is skin, so we are going to use the GGX modifier, and this is a slight change, very slight, and I really want to kind of hammer in and show the difference here and why this is more realistic. Let's go ahead, go to compare, store render buffer, and change this back to the Octane default. Notice right here along the edge of the head, the reflections stay too strong as it is, I'm going to disable our material picker. The reflections stay too strong as they're wrapping around the edge of our character's face. These reflections are too harsh. They should start getting rougher as we look at it from more of an angle. And as you can see, that is exactly what the GGX roughness set looks and how it works. And you can see this looks almost more like a metal, where this feels much more like a skin. See how we can get those differences there? Definitely a much bigger improvement. So that is very important to have this here. You can see it does help, and it does add a level of realism. So changing this BRDF model from this, which is Octane, looks way too strong here. The roughness isn't picked up enough as we go off of the kind of angle of the edge of the camera view we're looking at here. When I change this to GGX, instantly much better. If I use something like Beckman, though, instantly this makes it look even more like metal, because again, Beckman is more for metals and stuff, and GGX is more for organic elements like skin, hair, and food. Again, very, very powerful tools. Definitely recommended to check them out. I'm going to head and do Control S on my keyboard, save that. And the next thing what we are going to do in here is we are going to again organize up things a little bit. I accidentally drug my gamma on our little power slider here, so make sure I select that node, go back to our shader here, and make sure I have all my nodes selected. Make sure I go back to our gamma here and set that back to 2.2. And we're looking pretty good. Select all these nodes, pull them up, and we'll pull our bump up, and we'll move our normal map over. On a side note, just because I happen to bump this little power slider, these kind of bother me. If you don't like having the new Octane sliders that you can drag here, this is something new for Octane 2019 that they added, which is cool. I can mainly just drag the power here for whatever value this is. What is this? My bump I'm dragging up or down. That is kind of nice. You can just drag live like that. For me, it just gets in the way because I would like to select and edit them over here instead. So if you're like me and that bothers you, or this isn't the gamma, this is the power, I'll put that back to 1. You can disable this. To disable it, all you have to do is go into your settings, go to render settings with this little cog, go to settings, go to nodes, and then uncheck embedded UI. And as soon as I close this, go back and then back to my node editor, I think I might have to actually refresh my entire node editor to actually update. So I would have to go ahead, stop the render, switch, say to any layout, say standard. It's going to switch over, then switch back over to our R21 node layout, check out our nodes, and you can see that it still hasn't updated yet. This will take effect. I would just have to shut down Cinema 4D and reopen it, but as long as you have embedded GUI unchecked, when you close C4D, reopen it back up, they will disappear. I have tested that. I wasn't sure if switching the layout, though, would fix it. But with this out of the way, we're just going to go ahead and keep it and stick with it, but that is a little tip there if you would like to remove that effect. Now that we have this set up, though, let's go ahead back over to our node editor, and now let's go ahead, now that we have our actual maps plugged in, right? We have our roughness, we have our specular, everything is set up good, our skin's looking a lot nicer. Let's go ahead and fix our bump. The bump map from Cinema 4D looks good in a Cinema 4D material, but it's actually too strong in Octane. Octane interprets bump maps very strongly, so I want to go ahead and reduce the strength of this a bit. We'll select our bump map and pull our power down to something like 0.5. That feels a lot better for me. It's much less rough, and the bump is not overpowering like it was before, so this is much better. The next thing we're going to do now is actually bring some realism for our character by adding some subsurface scattering. This is going to be a big part of making our character look a lot more real. Let's go ahead and open this up here, raise it a little bit. And the first thing we're going to do is maximize our node editing window, and we are going to create some subsurface scattering with our character by changing the material type. There is two distinct types of subsurface scattering in Octane. There is, for Octane Master Course students, I'm sure you probably already know this, but I'm going to go ahead and recap it lightly for Mesh Evo students. There is two distinct types of subsurface scattering in Octane Render. There is specular subsurface scattering, which is like more of a transparent, clear subsurface scattering, which I can show you now. We're going to go ahead, select our material, go to basic, change our material from glossy to specular, press left control tab to zoom back out, and you can see there's our character. It looks like glass. This is, again, a type of subsurface scattering where we can create something like we could create like a scattering medium, plug this into the medium tab of our character, and we could adjust this. Let's go ahead and give ourselves, again, more space. We can go pull back, pull more. We can absorb in more to darken sooner, darken less, etc. You can do many different values on here. And we could thicken this up to make it similar like skin. Some workflows people talk about, they make skin this way. I do not actually recommend it. In some cases it could work, but in most cases it's a lot of work, and it really bogs down your render times because, again, you're dealing with a specular material for an entire character skin set, and you also have to mix it with a diffuse material, and it's just kind of complete, to be honest, a pain. So what I actually would rather do is use something called a diffuse subsurface scattering system, where we just set our material to a diffuse material. Just go to diffuse, and then with this one you can see it's already set up where we have subsurface scattering, and this type of subsurface scattering that we're getting from this character is still light penetrating through our character and shining out the other side, but this type of subsurface scattering is much more rough and scattered and diffuse, and it renders a lot quicker, and this is the type of subsurface scattering you would get more so with skin. Now the problem is, as soon as we go to a diffuse material, we lose any type of reflections. That's why we're going to use a different type of material. We're actually going to use the Octane Universal material, because that can have subsurface scattering like this with a diffuse material, but on top of that also have reflections. Now the reason this diffuse material is having this subsurface scattering right now is because it has a value called transmission pulled to white. Transmission is the light that is allowed to pass through the character and bounce into it and bounce out the other side of it. So if we have our transmission set to black, that is basically turned off subsurface scattering. No light is allowed to bounce in it or through it. But as soon as we start to brighten this up, this starts to determine the color of the light that we're allowed to bounce into it and through it. I could set this to green, and now we're going to have green light bounce in and through our character, etc., etc. Now, again, we don't want to use a diffuse material though, right? We want to use something much more advanced. Let's go back to basic, select our material, change this from the diffuse to universal. Now by default, the universal material is going to have a metallic layer enabled, so we're just going to go ahead and select that and disable it. We don't want our character looking like metal. And right out of the gate, it should look pretty similar to what we have already. We should already have our albedo set up, which is, we already have our color channel pumped into it. We already have our specular channel set up for that. The reason our specular map isn't actually working though, I do want to point this out, is because our specular value is. Actually, it is working. It should be. Sometimes if you have a color output in here, it will override the float, but the image texture will override everything. I forgot about that, actually. That is something I actually covered in the Octane Master Course. I just forgot that for a second, though. But the next thing that we should go through, I guess I should probably go through my own course again a few times to remember some things. The next thing we need to do, though, is we need to start setting up the subsurface scattering for this material. So for this universal material, what we need to change here is we're actually going to delete our scattering node, and what we're going to go ahead and pump into it is, again, our transmission. Works just like it did with our diffuse material. We'll go to transmission, pull this value up, and you can see that we're having an effect. Now, I don't want to feed the transition value with just a single color. I actually want to use the original map that we created up here. I want to use this image texture. And I know I don't just want to plug this image texture directly into it. I would actually like to use a little bit more power into it. I want to up the power value here. But if I do that here, that's just going to make my skin too bright. That changes the original look of what the skin was before. So I don't want to do that. So what I'm going to do instead is I'm just going to hold down left control and copy and drag this material down here so I have a nice copy of it. Then plug this into the transmission slot of our transmission slot on our material. Take this material and now increase its value to something like 2. Instantly, you can see our character is now having a bigger effect, definitely a lot brighter, because if I unplug this and I take our transmission and set it to black, that means it's not going to be on. So this is off, and then this is on. You can see we're getting much more light and brightness through our character. And you can actually see way too much light shining through. And if I look at the back of the character's head here, you can actually see that the light is shining right through our character. Now, in real life, heads will have a lot of elements inside of them that will block light and not allow light to shine through. A real human head is not going to be able to have light to shine through it like this. That's why it's very unrealistic looking. So what we need to actually do is we need to have some absorption. We need to have more scattering, some way to block and absorb that light so it can't shine through quite as strongly. To do this, it's actually really easy. We're going to, again, pull out that scattering medium node and take the scattering medium node and plug it into the medium slot here. As soon as I do that, instantly it has removed that effect there. It's no longer causing this issue. And if we go ahead and zoom in on our character's nose here, this should show a little bit of subsurface scattering, but not too much. If I unplug our medium, you'll see that we might actually get even more scattering over here, and not as much showing through on the nose, maybe a little bit, but again, we do have that light going through the back of the character's head. So by plugging in this medium, it does help quite a bit. Now, the reason this is stopping that scattering is because on our scattering node, we have our density value by default at 100, and that density is what's saying, okay, our character's head has density to it. It actually has absorption properties. It's no longer able to absorb all the way down or not absorb down and let that light shine through. Now we're actually absorbing down and preventing that light from passing through. Now by default, our absorption value is just black. It's just absorbing down to black. Now for human skin and heads, it's never going to absorb down to pure black. There's always going to be variations in color and just different tones and stuff that are going to be affecting that absorption. And that's why you want to actually take your character's image texture that you have plugging into the albedo or the diffuse and actually plug that into your scattering node's absorption properties. So this way the light will absorb down based off of that color. As the light absorbs into the character's head, it is going to absorb down into whatever color the character's skin is and different type of variations you might have painted onto it, and then that is going to look much more realistic. So when the light bounces off of it or the character's head has less subsurface scattering, that is still going to be slightly tinted in a more realistic way of that character's head. For example, the light that would be absorbing through the character's nose right here is going to take a little bit more tint of that color, just making it a little bit more realistic. Now that we have that on there, the next thing that we want to go ahead and set up and do is we want to have a little bit of scattering, because right now the light is just kind of shooting directly into our character and going straight through it. It's not really bouncing around or having anything. Like the light right here for our character's nose is really shining through way too strongly. What we want is to have this light feel like there's some more density to our character. As it hits into our character, it's going to be refracted and bounced around. And that's like subsurface scattering it is on real life. When light shines onto your hands or something, it goes in underneath your skin, and then that light is bounced and refracted around, and then eventually that light will bounce back out. That is what creates believable subsurface scattering. So we're going to go ahead up here and we're going to grab ourselves a float texture, and we're going to plug this into the scattering slot. And we're going to go ahead for our float texture, give it a value of, I think 1. I think a value of 1 would do pretty good. Maybe a value of 2. And you can see instantly this is started to dissipate and spread around that subsurface scattering effect far more. Let's go ahead and grab our little render region. and render this part of our character quickly and compare it. This is a value of 1, and this is a value not of 102. We don't want that. We want a value of 0. So this is 0. Look, that light is way too strong, way too harsh. It's not spreading around the light near enough on the skin. We need that light to be more spreaded out a little bit. So we'll set it back to a value of 1. Instantly, this is doing a much better job of that. And in fact, we could even up this to a value of 2 possibly, which might look a little bit better. The next thing I want to actually do is for our scattering node. I feel like a value of 100 is a little too dense for our character that it is right now. We could go ahead and reduce that. We could go ahead and say, drop our value, for the size of our character, a value of 100 is just a little too much. So I'm thinking a value of maybe 50. And you can say 50 is pretty good. If we go too low, then the light's going to be shining through our character's head again. We don't want that. So let's go ahead and up it to a value of 50. And I feel like with our scattering, that is doing a good job of preventing the light from shining through so harshly. Now that we have that done there, we can see that we're getting some good scattering on our ear here. It's a little intense, so it's going to depend on the shape of your mesh and stuff in different areas. This scattering we're getting through here isn't too bad. It actually looks pretty decently good. We could up our density a little bit to remove some of that. A value of 100 is pretty good. I could even take our scattering value and up that to, say, 50, which will really, actually, 50 is way too much. I don't know what I was thinking on that. Maybe a value of 5. Yeah, a value of 5 of scattering is doing pretty good. It breaks that up, spreads it out quite nicely. 5, maybe 4. Let's just go with a value of 3. I actually don't mind this. I feel like it looks pretty good. I mean, we do have a very harsh amount of sunlight, so this level of light and scattering that we're getting through the ear here really isn't that bad. Looks pretty good. In most lighting situations, it should look pretty decent, so feel free to adjust this. You could add more scattering to compensate for that, or add more absorption just to remove it. For the nose, though, everything is looking good. I really like this. Now, you will notice we're getting a lot more fireflies on our character, and that is as soon as I add that scattering, it is going to start scattering that light all over, and that's just far more render intensive, and that can cause fireflies that just take time to clean up. This is because we're having more light spread around and evenly light and distribute our character's face and just make it more lifelike. We're actually getting light that's kind of scattering around across different parts of our character's face. The light is hitting only in the front, and we're having more shadows on the side, but that light is still able to bounce over and scatter over into the shadows and bring a little bit of life and brightness into there. This said, you could just let it render a little more. I mean, we're still getting 28 seconds in, we're getting this at, like, what are we, 400 samples, and it already looks pretty clean. Not bad. This said we can render it even faster. If we go ahead, go to our render settings, go over to kernels, and then make sure that our GI clamp is actually at a lower value, so maybe a value of 10. Just by dropping this, that should help clean up our fireflies much quicker. I could even drop this to a value of 1, and that'll almost get rid of them instantly. You can see, like, we're no longer having fireflies as bad as we were. At a value of 1, they're almost completely gone. At a value of 10, they're definitely there, but they are going to start cleaning up a little faster. By 100 samples, we should have most of them relatively cleaned out. Right now, they're already cleaning up pretty strongly, and about 128 samples it is looking pretty good. I'm going to go ahead and keep GI clamp at a value of 10 because I feel like that's a pretty good size. The next thing we need to do, now that we have that subsurface scattering set up there, and it is looking pretty nice, we have our picture viewer updating a little bit there. That's why it kind of froze up on us. But now that we have this done, what we're going to go ahead and do is we have some pretty good subsurface scattering. I like it. It looks good. I'm just going to go ahead and now go over to our node editor, and we're going to do a little bit of a trick to slightly bring even more realism to this character, because right now what we have going on is legit subsurface scattering. This is very realistic. It's light that is bouncing onto the surface of our character, scattering through it, and bouncing back off of it after it bounces through it. So very realistic subsurface scattering. Now, if you would like to take your character's skin tone to the next level and, in my opinion, make it look even better, there is a little bit of a hack or trick that's not necessarily very realistic, but it can make it look nicer. This trick is where you actually take a texture emission node, and this is how you make your material actually behave like a light source. And if I go ahead and plug this into the emission slot, it's going to go ahead and make our character much, much brighter. Now, you can see that this is very unrealistic. It literally made our character into acting like a light bulb. Now, that is not what we want, and that's not very realistic. But if I go ahead and take our image texture up here, and I plug this into our texture emission node, I take our albedo color, plug that into texture, then take this and drop the power down to something like 1, 1 is still too strong, something like maybe 0.2. 0.2 is very unnoticeable, but the realism that this does, it just brightens up our character's skin very, very subtly. What this is doing is I'm faking the effect of more light bouncing through our character, basically. So instead of our character's skin tones and such, trying to have more light bounce through them by forcing more light to bounce into our character's skin and then bounce off of it, I'm simply skipping the middleman and just simply emitting light from our character's skin to make our character's skin look brighter and more lifelike. So instead of trying to force more light to bounce in and then out, I'm just simply firing more light out. That is essentially what I'm trying to fake or simulate, is more light bouncing from our character's skin just to give it a little bit more life to it. So I'm just going to go ahead and show you the difference. We're going to do compare, store render buffer, take our texture emission node, and just unplug it. And now here is the before and after, and you can see this is without. It is a little noisy, it's going to have to clean up, and this is with. But already you can see, look how much more lifelike the shadows of our character's the skin on the shadows on our character's skin face is lighting up. And that's really what adds realism to your character, is these dark patches like here underneath the chin and the cheek and in the ear. These areas are much brighter now because we're actually emitting light from that. And this is simulating the light that would scatter through our character's skin that would help brighten up those shadows anyway. Because again, our face isn't made of cement or rock or some impenetrable force. Our face and our skin is made of something that light can absorb into and shine through to an extent, and that is scattered around. So adding a kind of light almost to your character's face can, believe it or not, make your character look much more realistic if you use it in a small amount. Again, I really want to push that home. Make sure that's very clear. If you make this too strong, it is not going to look good. Because again, if we plug this in and we set this to a value of 10, this doesn't add any realism at all. And I mean, use this very lightly. If I use this even a value of 2, a value of 1, even a value of 0.5, that is too much. Your character looks fake. It doesn't look real. But if you use just a little bit, just a tiny bit, 0.2, that can clean things up very, very well, and just enough clean up those dark shadows on your character's face and really make your character come to life. Again, though, this is subjective, so it's up to you to decide on whether you want to have it and how much you want to use it, but realize this is a pretty handy tip, and I do use this quite frequently because I really do like the results. One thing I will recommend, though, is under your light, make sure you uncheck diffuse, specular, and cast shadows for all of these, because, again, you just want to brighten up the darker areas, so you don't want to actually cast shadows, you don't want it to actually behave as a light source. You don't want it lighting anything else up. You just simply want to brighten up your actual character's face. The next thing I will mention, now that we have this set up, because we're basically pretty good. The skin tone, I feel like, is looking really nice here. If you we disable this and we look at it, everything is looking really good. I do like this. But the final thing I do want to change is, you will notice, if we go back to look at our character, it is going to freeze up again as it's updating the little preview in our perspective Octane, or not Octane, the Cinema 4D OpenGL preview here. You can see that it freezes up whenever it's trying to update that there. It takes a little bit of time. But our character is having subsurface scattering on the entire body of our character. And that is not good, right? The cloth and the clothing that our character is wearing is not going to have the same type of subsurface scattering, if any subsurface scattering at all, like our face is having. Our face would have subsurface scattering, but the rest of the body should not, because this is, again, clothing, and clothing is going to behave differently than skin. Luckily, it's extremely easy to simply separate this. All you have to do is paint some type of black and white mask, where you can say, okay, use subsurface scattering on this part, but don't on this part. Or, in our case, because we're in Cinema 4D, we can actually just simply use a Vertex map and feed that directly into Octane and have that read it instead. So to create a Vertex map in Cinema 4D that we can use with Octane, I'm simply just going to go ahead and select our mesh for our character, use the shortcut N+Q to disable our material view, then use the shortcut N+B to grab up our Garrode shading with lines. We can actually see the polygons, and we're going to go ahead and go to polygon mode, disable our subdivision surface, disable our displacer. We just want to look at the raw mesh. I'm going to use the shortcut UL That is U and then L on my keyboard. So again, U and then L, and then I'll grab my loop selection tool. I'm just going to go ahead and grab this loop of polygons right here by putting my mouse right in the center of this kind of polygon line that's rotating there. And I'm going to left click, and then it's going to grab a perfect loop selection around our character's head. Then I'm going to use the shortcut U plus F to grab my fill tool, hold down left shift, and then left click on my character's head up here to fill in the rest of those polygon selections. And now I'm actually going to go to select and then do set vertex weight and set its value to 100%. Press enter, and instantly we've created a perfect mask separating the head from the body. This vertex map can be used in Octane to separate where our subsurface scattering is going to take effect. This is actually really easy. All we have to do now is go back to object mode, deselect our vertex map so that disappears, go back to our node editor, and now all we have to do is grab the vertex map node that's down here at the bottom of our node list. We'll just grab vertex map, select vertex map, and drag and drop our vertex map node into the listing right here. And now that we've done that, we can actually start controlling and adjusting this to give us some good results. So what we can do is I'm just going to do, again, left control plus tab to maximize this view, and let's go ahead and start working. If we go ahead and take this vertex map node and just plug it into our albedo here, you can go ahead and start seeing the effect that it's having on our character here. You can see that it's created a mask. Now the reason the rest of the body doesn't look like black is because we actually have our transmission and our emission and our medium plugged in. But if I pull those out, you can see this is essentially the result we get. We have a vertex map that is displaying the head is white and the body is black. This is a perfect mask because we can use a node called the Octane multiply node that basically takes anything that is black and multiplies it by anything else that's any color and makes it black. But if it takes anything that's white and it multiplies that by any color, it won't do anything to it. So basically, we can take this vertex map and crop away any of the black areas, force that to be black, but leave all the white areas white. This is really cool, meaning if we take a multiply node and we plug our color map into it, say this diffuse map that we have up here, right? Let's go ahead and just maximize our view again. We can take this image texture for our color, plug this into slot 1, take our vertex map node, plug that into slot 2, plug this into our albedo, and then instantly we have the character's face showing through very nicely. We have the original color and all that, but the rest of the body is still black. We can use this to our advantage. All we have to do now is set the same setup, but except that we're going to be using our this little map we had here for our transmission. So we're going to do the same thing, except this time we're going to go ahead and take this multiply node and we're going to plug in our image texture for our transmission is slot 1. And then our vertex map node can still say at slot 2, and then plug this, instead of into our albedo, we're going to plug that into transmission. Now we're going to be having subsurface scattering for just the face, not for the body. So you can kind of see it's already happening a little bit. There we go. We are getting subsurface scattering for the face, but if we move down a little bit, we can see that it is not happening for the body perfectly, because again, the body is still staying as a black color and the head is the only one staying as a white color, or in this case, whatever color we happen to plug into it, and that is the color of our image texture. This is great. Black does not have any subsurface scattering, and anything that's above black will start to have it. So this is perfect. This is giving us exactly what we want. Next, we need to make a copy of our multiply node, because remember, now we need to have our scattering medium plugged in. We need to have some type of blockage here to kind of prevent the light from shining directly through our character's head. Now what we need to do is we need to actually control where the absorption happens. We need to do the same thing. We're going to take this multiply node. Let's go ahead and full size this here. We're going to make a copy of it. I'm just going to organize things a little bit so we can have a little bit easier time looking at everything. We're going to pull this over, pull both of these over, and what we're going to do, hold down left control, copy this multiply node, plug the vertex again into texture slot 2, and for texture slot 1, we're going to plug in this float texture. We're going to go ahead and take that float texture that's plugged into our multiply, plug that into our scattering, and now we're doing the same effect. We're only having scattering. Black is no scattering, and anything above black is going to start to cause scattering. And now we're plugging in our float texture, and it's going to pump in with a value of 3, but that is only going to show up where it is actually plugged in with the brightness areas, and that's going to be where our vertex map is saying this area is white, you can go through there, and this area is black, you can't. Now we're going to do the same thing. We're going to hold down left control, we're going to make another copy, plug this vertex map again, you guessed it, into texture slot 2, and now we're going to have to determine where our light should be emitted. We're going to go ahead and take this little plug that was plugged into our texture emission node, and remember that is our albedo map, or our color map up here. Plug that also into our multiply node, and then plug this into texture, and plug that into our emission slot over here. Now, what's really cool about this, again, black means don't emit light, and anything above black will emit light. And because we're using our texture vertex map node, now we're only going to be emitting light from our character's head, because instead of emitting light before, which was only through our character's, which was before from our character's entire body, we're saying on our vertex map node, essentially cropping it, saying no, don't do anywhere that's black, that's our whole body, except where it's white, where our character's face is, and we're multiplying that, so we're allowing the original color of this diffuse image to come and shine through, which is really cool. Now, the reason our character looks so white is because I forgot to plug in our albedo, so we need to plug that back in, and that should clean things up much, much nicer. We simply have, I believe, one more to plug in, and that would be for, or actually, I think we have them all plugged in. We have our emission, we have our transmission, and we have our medium. I did forget to add our absorption, though, so we will have to have another one. Now, here's a cool thing, though. Because our absorption is actually already set up, you'll notice that our absorption right here is running from this image texture up here, our Romy color map. This same map is being fed into this multiply right here, the same one for our texture emission node. So we don't have to make a copy. It's already doing what we want. Let's just go ahead and plug this right in here, and that's essentially solved the problem for us. Now, these wires are starting to get crossed, so I'm going to just move these down, just keep things a little bit more organized. There we go, a little bit nicer, and lo and behold, we've now done it. We have our transmission. We have our emission, creating that fake subsurface scattering. We have our medium that's absorbing it down, so we're not allowing light to shine too far and too brightly through our character. And we're all limiting that through this beautiful, amazing power of the vertex map that we did through this selection here. If I go back to view, this is all controlling and giving us a live adjustable mask that is incredible. And this can be adjusted live. Like literally, I could start painting out here, and now if I go back over to our node editor, go to our texture emission node and increase our power, you can see that light is now emitting from there. We can do this live. We could say, okay, let's paint more, and you can see right before our eyes, it is updating. I'm going to do Control-Z to undo those changes, of course, because we don't want that, but you can see it's done a really good job. Now, you'll notice around our character's neck here, I actually did my polygon selection a little too high. I actually missed part of the skin here. I should have done one row lower. That's okay. All we have to do is go to our character, select our vertex map tag, do the shortcut in polygon mode UL, and I do want to make sure our mesh is selected, and I'm just going to do a UL selection here, holding down left shift. So I'm now adding this to the entire selection, and now again I have my vertex map tag selected, the one we already have set up. I'm just going to go again to select and set vertex weight 100%, and add that, and now that dropped that back down there, cleaning that up for us. So now that is much, much better, and now we have subsurface scattering again, going through the whole face, more into our skin, and more for our character. Now, in this case, because we don't have enough polygon resolution, the polygons did drop the subsurface scattering down low enough now where it's starting to affect a little bit of the cloth, but to be honest, that's really not that big of a deal. It's not causing that many issues, and it's overall looking pretty darn good. Now, you may notice that we're getting kind of like a visible, almost like it cleans itself up, like if I let this sit and we render it like with this with our render region node here, you can see that cleans it up really nice. But while it's rendering, it is a little bit noisy, and this is just because this is two different distinct how these textures are working. This is the subsurface scattering. You can see the distinct line in between. This is the subsurface scattering. This is not. Now, if you wanted more detail, you'd want to actually paint a map with body paint or something like that. Again, we are limited to our polygon size here, and in this particular case, I think it looks better than if we were clipping into the skin, making the skin look too dark. It was looking kind of like there was no subsurface scattering there, so it looked like it was kind of dead. So this does do better, and once it actually renders, it does clean it up. But I wanted to let you know that that is why we're getting kind of like that sampling kind of issue there. But the beauty is we can tell that this is working if we go over to our node editor, and I take our power for our light, we crank it up, we can see, boom, this is where it is emitting light, and this is where it is not. So it is actually working. Very nice. We're going to set this back down to a value of 0.2. And it's actually quite amazing that we're actually, the areas with subsurface scattering are actually rendering even more clean faster than the areas without subsurface scattering. And I believe that's just because of the roughness that we applied to the body. It's actually amazing that Octane is actually able to render that so well. I will make sure that our specular map is plugged in correct, our roughness map is set up, everything is good. I'm really not sure why we're getting more noise there than up here, or not that it's more noise, it's just kind of a difference per se. But it's very interesting, and if we zoom in, we should be able to see, yeah, we can see inside the character. Here is below where the subsurface scattering is happening, and here is above where the subsurface scattering is happening. The good news is, though, is once you actually let this render and clean up, it all goes away and you lose kind of like that connected seam there. Again, if you paint this a little bit more smooth and you didn't use a vertex map, that would be even less noticeable. But overall, pretty darn nice, and once it starts rendering and cleaning out, you can't even see the difference. The noise in every area cleans out, does a really good job, cleans up. And to be honest, this character's turned out really, really nice. And you know what actually would clean this up even more is if I re-enabled, of course, we're all looking at this without having our subdivision surface and our displacement node on. So now that those are on, that will maybe smooth things out a little bit. We can go ahead and resend the scene. We'll see, it may or may not. The point is it still cleans itself up. Yeah, it's still there, but it will clean itself up as time goes on through the render. So looking very nice, very clean, very, very good. And I feel like, again, we are really getting the skin tones are really shining through and looking nice. And we're getting some good subsurface scattering through areas that mattered, like on the nose here and around the lips and stuff, and the eyebrows and the back of the ear. We're getting some very beautiful subsurface scattering for our character that's really kind of going through and really, to be completely honest, really coming to life here. So extremely happy with how this has turned out. I really do hope you found this helpful. At this point, there is a few parts of our character that we could texture more, like the gauntlets over here. They could be textured more. We could work more on the clothing now that we have this mask. We could do even more work. Like we could do something like for our node layer, we could do this right now, complete honestly. We could go to something called our Sheen Layer and crank that up to the top and give it a really high value. And you can see what this does is it creates like this kind of soft, fuzzy look. Now for our character's face, this doesn't look right or good at all. But what's crazy is for our character's clothing, it can create this really kind of like there's a bunch of fibers or fuzz on the edge of our character's clothing. What's super cool is I could literally just by hand plug in this vertex map into the sheen value right here on our node, on our material, and that will automatically separate it. So it will no longer happen on the face, and it'll only happen on the body. And it's actually the inverse, because white means it's on, black means it's off. So we actually need to invert this. Luckily, we can do something really easy just by creating an invert node. So all we would literally have to do is just pull out an invert node, and I accidentally plugged that into our normal map, so that's going to wonk things out really quick. I'm just going to re-plug a normal map back in where it should be, and then take this vertex map, plug it into this invert node, and then plug that invert node finally into our sheen port. And then as soon as we have our sheen plugged in, we'll have sheen on the actual character's clothing, which can make that look more realistic, like it has like little fuzz and hairs and stuff on it, but not on our character's face. So again, we have full control at any time with this vertex map. We could select it, paint out wherever our character has skin, and the skin would show up perfectly, and then we'd have different areas for clothing that wouldn't be skin, which would have this nice kind of sheen. Again, this is very heavily handed being used, so I go back to our sheen layer, take our sheen roughness and drop that down. If I set this to 0, you're basically not going to see it. But if I do a value of like 0.2, you can see we're getting this kind of beautiful sheen roughness on our character, like there's some fuzz with this cloth or something. Maybe a value of even 0.5 is way too strong. Maybe a value of 0.3. 0.3 is looking pretty nice, and this is based off the perspective you're looking at. Maybe 0.25. 0.25 is pretty good. I like that. That's adding some really cool kind of looks and value to our character. I'm really happy with how this turned out. Pretty darn nice. At this point, though, again, there's a few other areas we could texture up. We could clean up a few other areas. But to be honest, everything else I feel like I've explained pretty well so far. And I think you have a pretty good understanding of it now. We've gone over the more difficult, harder spots. So everything else would just be doing more of what we've already done. So there's really not much left to really teach that is new. I am going to do a very light recap of what we've gone over before we end this video, just as a final refresher. So to start, in this video, what did we learn? We learned how to take a character from Cinema 4D, or a character that would be technically, I guess, really rendered in any other render engine, or made to work with any other render engine, like such as example the Cinema 4D physical render engine, and we learned how to convert those materials over to work with Octane render in Cinema 4D. We learned how to report those materials over, that whole setup, and refix up that character to work in render in Octane and look really nice. If I do say so myself, I feel like this character has really turned out amazing. We also learned that this character was made in the course Mesh Evo. This Mesh Evo course teaches you how to make this character from scratch, from the beginning, starting with nothing, all the way up to what we have here. And a big thanks to the whole reason this character quite honestly looks so good is because it was made really well. And you can learn how to make this exact character right here in that course as well. So definitely check that out. In the link of the description of this video, we'll go ahead and give you access or give you access to the link so you can check that course out and see if that's something you're interested in purchasing or not. The other thing we learned in this video is that Octane has some trouble with the displacement maps for our character, and we found that these displacement maps are super powerful because they add more realism to our character's features, such as being able to sculpt out high detailed displacement maps that can, when enabled, give more displacement and shape to our character's face here, for example. We learned that Octane's displacement node right now is not fully up to the task of getting this correct, especially on displacement maps from Cinema 4D. This said, we found that the best workaround was to simply take a subdivision surface, put our mesh underneath of that, and then put that subdivision surface next to a displacer in a null, so they're under their own individual null, and then simply adding that displacement map to our displace deformer here, going over to object, changing our type so it has the proper map type for our displacement, set to tangent, because again, there's two different types of displacement maps. We have a vertex map or a height map. Height maps, again, were black and white, and a vertex map was something that looks a little bit like a normal map, kind of rainbowy looking. And we found that they are super cool and powerful because, again, they look something like this. These types of maps can be used inside Cinema 4D or Octane Render or tons of different applications to create displacement maps that can displace in tons of different directions, not just up and down or out and forward. It's not just black and white. We have all the different axes in 3D space available to us. And we found that we can load that into here by setting the proper type, which we are using a tangent map. So we plug that in, set our shading underneath our shading here. We made sure to go into our map and set the color profile to sRGB. This was very important to make sure that the map was read correctly and we didn't have any issues, because if it's read by the embedded default, you can see it is a mess. So sRGB, very big deal to make sure that this is read correctly. On top of that, we also wanted to make sure that we matched our height value. When Cinema 4D had this for its material here, the displacement built into Cinema 4D materials, it said to use a height value of 2 centimeters, and that is what we want to replicate in our displacer as well, because again, they run under the same apples per apples algorithm. This is basically the same type of displacement that the materials have internally. It's just now we have it as our own separate little node here, or a separate little object that we can enable and disable at will that works with any render engine. This is simply just doing it to the mesh, not at render time. Since it's done before render time, we have much more control, and it can be used with any render engine, including Octane render, the physical render if you wanted, Arnold, and even Redshift. So plenty of options here. We also learned in this video that a really great way of creating subsurface scattering for our character's face was by using a universal material and creating a more diffuse material subsurface scattering effect by plugging into the transmission slot. And we got these values by plugging in a copy of our character's color map that we increased the power to a value of 2 just to brighten it up a bit. Now, to fix this from being too bright on areas where it shouldn't be, like shining in completely through the back of the character's head, what we did is we also added a scattering map where we added some absorption with a value density of 100 just to kind of keep that light from shining too harshly through our character's skin here. What we also did is we added some scattering, that we use a float texture just to help scatter around the light that was bouncing on our character's skin so it doesn't shine directly through, and it kind of bounces around and creates a little bit more realism. On top of that, to add another level of realism, we also, to help enhance the light that's bouncing off of our character's face to make it even more lifelike, we plugged in a texture emission node just to add a little bit more light. And I am going to go ahead and mention the reason we did not plug this texture emission node into our scattering mediums emission slot, because you may may be wondering that, is if I did that, I'm going to go ahead and crank, not our density, I don't know why I'm messing around with that, let's go ahead our density back to 100. If I crank our brightness value up, you'll notice that when we are actually pumping in light through our emission slot on the scattering medium node, this will actually only create light in the more dense areas of our character and not on the thinner areas, such as the eyes, the nose, or the mouth. This is non-uniform lighting, and I did not want that. For the subsurface scattering type of light effect I did want it to be uniform, so I do want to plug this into the emission slot on our actual material, not on the scattering node. So that is why I did that. Let's go ahead and drop this value back down again to 0.2, because we learned that it's important that we use this very, very lightly. Don't use it heavy-handedly. Make sure it is just a little bit. We also made sure that we turned off our visible and diffuse, specular, and cast shadows. Everything in this row went off because we don't want it to actually behave and act like a light. Thank you again so much for watching this. I really do. I hope that you found this helpful. I really do hope you found this helpful. I can talk. I hope that this was kind of enlightening a little bit for you to help you figure out how to texture a character in Octane, or how to take a character that was already made and kind of bring it over. I hope that this info on the skin shader was helpful, and I really do hope that this kind of back-around workflow for displacement of characters and such like that, where you can disable and enable it at will, was helpful for you as well. And I hope you found a lot of usefulness about learning about the Vertex map and how you can run that through multiply nodes to limit and restrict effects such as subsurface scattering and sheen layer effects to different parts of a character's body. So only the clothing looks like it has that sheen effect, and only the skin looks like it has a subsurface scattering, etc. Again, I really do hope you found this helpful, and I cannot wait to see you all in the next video.